खंडन करता सम्यक दर्शन मुझने मर्जो सम्यक ज्ञान मुझने मर्जो सम्यक
Janendra, and good evening to everyone tuning in. Firstly, thank you for making the time on your Sunday to join this session. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Basanthi, and I'm a trustee of Oshwal Association of the UK. I am very excited to introduce today's session, which is focusing on the climate crisis and how our ancient Jain philosophies and principles can play a significant role in managing a way forward. It is also extremely timely as we have COP28 taking place in Dubai at the moment. We hope that you will find today's session insightful and also leave you with some food for thought. A bit of housekeeping before we dive in. We have about 45 minutes to an hour, so we will be finishing no later than the top of the hour. There will be some interactivity in this session. So when prompted, if you could log on to menti.com, we will provide you with a code which will lead to some questions. And I'd strongly encourage you all to participate in this as it will help us guide today's session. Now, without further ado, we're delighted to be joined by Serena Shah today. Following a successful career in finance across London and Singapore, Serena now leads nature restoration and conservation projects across sub-Saharan Africa at Shell Nature-Based Solutions. She has a vast 15 years of commercial and finance experience across various businesses, including low-carbon fuels, digital startups, and energy trading. So a very warm welcome, Serena. Over to you.
Thank you. And Janendra, everyone, thank you so much for spending your Sunday evening with me. So a little bit about me. I was born and bred in London to two amazing parents, Meena Ben and Dinesh Pai. And I was really fascinated about Jainism growing up. So I studied mathematics and management in London, and my dissertation was actually on the concepts of infinity within Jain mathematics. And at that point, it really opened up my mind and my eyes to how undiscovered and how under-researched Jain philosophy and Jain science really is. Like many Oshwals and Jains all around the world, I entered the world of finance and accountancy. And I guess you can say we can enter the World Book of Guinness Records for the highest number of finance and accountancy professionals within the Jain community worldwide. But when I graduated, I actually took the unusual step of working for an energy company. So it's one of the largest energy companies in the world. It wasn't unusual at the time. A lot of my friends went into investment banking and were studying medicine as well. But I decided to take that path for a number of reasons. I've spent over a decade, as Basanthi had mentioned, within commercial finance roles. I started off in the energy trading business. And then I transitioned quite quickly to supporting areas of the business which were more aligned with my values and my Jain values. So I actually ended up working on some really cool projects involving green hydrogen, sustainable aviation fuel. And you might have heard in the news that we had the world's first flight from London to America using 100% sustainable aviation fuel, and a number of other renewable energy sources. I decided to leave finance, which is, again, maybe quite unusual for the Jain community. I left finance back in 2021, and I moved directly into what we call the nature-based solutions business, which is responsible for investing and developing nature-based solutions projects or carbon projects, which basically means that you try and help to restore and protect nature, benefiting local communities, the environment, biodiversity, and supporting all companies, not just energy companies, in their decarbonization efforts. So what drives me is many things, but I'm very passionate about championing private sector investment into nature and into nature restoration. So, finance is a vital enabler of climate action, and we are in the decade of decisive action, right? And when it comes to humanity's most pressing challenge, it is the climate crisis. So at this point in time, it doesn't matter who you are or who you work for, it comes down to action. And I'm sure you've been seeing many things in the news at the moment or reading many things online about COP28. So I'm here in my personal capacity to talk about the climate crisis and Jainism. In my personal life, I've lived in different countries. I've spent some time in Singapore, in Italy, and several months in India. I'm really fascinated also with yoga and meditation, and I love practicing and teaching those things too. I actually live in a vegan household, so both my parents are vegan, and I try and avoid dairy as much as possible. I know I always have to talk about diet because Jains, they're known for their diets, aren't they? So that's a little about me, and I hope in this webinar, I'm not a climate expert, I'm not a Jain scholar, so Michami Dukuram if I do say anything that doesn't meet your expectations, but I hope to at least shed some light, if we move on to the next slide, on the climate crisis in general. So my wish for you today is to leave this webinar feeling just a little bit more inspired to act, just a little bit more curious to learn, a little bit more passionate or enthusiastic about having conversations with family, with friends. And we want to try and plant the seeds for hope, plant the seeds for action and collective action as communities. And also just to try and appreciate, this really ancient philosophy that originates from India. It's called Jainism. Not many people know about it. There's probably 6 million, I think, of us in the world compared to a population of 8.1 billion. So this is my wish for today. So let's see how we go. We've got a lot of ground to cover. But before we start, so on the screen, you may see right now what the UN Secretary General just this Friday announced to world leaders at COP28, which is the UN's climate change conference happening in Dubai. And this is Antonio Guterres. He's the UN Secretary General. And I'm just going to leave you to read that here because he makes things very real, and he really does try his best to try and push this agenda across all governments. So just wanted to start with that. And in terms of the agenda, moving on to the next slide, I wanted to share more principles, so 2 in specific about Jain philosophy. Wanted to share a little bit more about the impacts and causes of the climate crisis. There are many, and this is such a big topic. When I was making this presentation, I found it quite difficult actually to say, okay, what is it that I need to talk? There's so many important things in this, but I've tried to distill it and tried to put a different spin on it as much as I can, as much as I could. And then lastly, we'll talk about solutions. What can we do as individuals? What can we do as a community? And so that's the agenda for today. Let's see how we go. Now, Basanti mentioned that there's going to be a kind of live survey, a live quiz. So what I'd like you to do is if you go to menti.com, so it's www.menti.com, on your phones, or you can open up a new tab in your laptop, and you're going to type in this code that you see here. It's called 1125233, because we're going to ask you a question. We're going to ask you a question about how you're feeling about the climate crisis, and we want to see, what you guys are thinking, what you guys are seeing, what's your what's your level of concern around this topic, what do you know about this topic? So feel free to type in anything that comes to your mind, and I'll leave this on the screen here so you can see. And then I'm going to hand it over to Basanti, but www.menti.com, and you can also see the results coming in now as well. And so you see here lots of anxiety is probably what I'd say. There is this thing called eco-anxiety. It's real. We know that the climate crisis is and will continue to impact mental health. Helpless, okay. Annoyed, doubtful, negative. Yeah, there's a lot of negativity in the news, and I'm going to have to say sorry now because there is a little bit of doom and gloom in what I'm going to share with you, but there is some hope as well. So I hope to keep this balanced. It's too late. Wow. Sad to see the nature loss, disillusioned. So yeah, there's a lot of negative sentiment, and you can't be blamed, right? There's who can blame you for feeling this way? Selfish, bleak, terrified. Okay. So I'm getting a sense that those of you dialing in, and perhaps this reflects the sentiments of many across the globe, that yeah, we are worried. We feel very anxious. So we're going to now move on. So thank you so much for those of you that contributed to that. I wanted to see and kind of test where we were in this, and then I'll try and keep the doom and gloom in my presentation to a minimum, which I'm sure I will. But so we're going to talk about Jainism, right? So why is Jainism so important now more than ever? And this is a really beautiful sutra or a statement from the Tattva Sutra. It's an ancient text in Jainism. And it's basically talking about how we have always been interconnected. Every species, every living organism, every bacteria, including the gut microbiome, every element of the universe, water, air, fire, earth, we are all interconnected, and we're bound together by this mutual support. And this ancient indigenous wisdom, Jainism, right, what I'm talking about, is about life and how to protect life, and how when you cause harm to one piece of life, you cause harm to everything else in that web of life. So for life to thrive at its full potential, this is why virtues like compassion, karuna, maitri, friendliness, and they're so essential. So I thought that this would be a really nice opening to actually see what is Jainism all about. And straight away, you are hit by this, oh my God, all of life is interconnected. So much depth and knowledge there. And on the next slide here, meditation on nature. So why Jainism is so unique in this aspect is that there is no other philosophy, system, or framework in the world that actually classifies life according to their level of sentience. So here you've got this classification of 1 sense organisms. So they only have the sense of touch, all the way to 5 sense organisms like humans. And the reason why they've classified it in this way is to minimize harm or ahimsa to all of life. So it's a really highly sophisticated classification and we're just touching the tip of the iceberg here when it comes to knowledge. And this is a subset of a much broader Jain framework, but we'll just talk about this. But the Jainism essentially recognizes in its basic fact, no one wants to feel harm, no one wants to feel pain, no one wants to feel suffering. Whether you're 1 sense or whether you're 5 sense, it's the same. But as you go down from 1 sense to 5 sense, you are actually measuring how a living being feels and perceives. And the higher your ability to feel and perceive, for example, the 2, 3, 4, 5 sense beings, the higher the level of pain, pleasure, and suffering you're going to feel. Now, Jains, we all know this, right? This is kind of, we may learn this during our childhood, or if you're new to this, you're thinking, wow, but this helps us understand why for thousands of years, Jains have focused on a plant-based diet, essentially focusing on the 1 sense, right? To try and avoid and minimize harm on the 2 to 5 sense. So such a deeply compassionate approach, it's truly unique to Jainism. And here we go again on this web of life, the fact that everything is interconnected. So all of these 1 sense beings, whether you're a bacteria, a bee, or humans, tigers, even all the organisms, microorganisms that live in the air, that live in the water, we're all interconnected in this web of life. And this sacred indigenous wisdom is all about the science of perception and understanding these very subtle, states of feeling and perceiving, which is so different to modern microbiology or microecology that basically looks at the physical characteristics of life, whether you have a backbone or you don't have a backbone, whether you're from the animal kingdom or the plant kingdom, these sorts of things. So this shows you the depth of this ancient wisdom. So on the next slide, I'm actually going to share with you some other unique facts that basically should highlight the sophistication of Jainism. And the fact is, in the 17th century, you may or may not know that there was a Dutch inventor, might have been French, but anyway, in the 17th century, he invented the microscope. And then from there, he was able to say, okay, wow, there's, through my microscope, I can see all these microorganisms living in water. And then from the 17th century onwards, there was this broader acknowledgement that, yes, there is life in water. It's not just, water, there's other organisms living there. Similarly, in the 19th century, modern science started to look into plants and their ability to respond to stimuli, and the fact that, yes, they are sensitive, yes, they do respond to certain conditions that are around them. Same thing happened in soil as well, but the movement and the research in soil is actually only happening more recently. So what is super interesting is that the Jain tradition recognized that there was microorganisms and various infinite forms of life in water, in plants, in soil, thousands of years ago. And this is super, super impressive, right? Because even if you look into the ancient texts, it actually describes the number of microorganisms that you can expect to live in water. So-called water bodies, or you have earth bodies, fire bodies, air bodies. And so even modern biology today, or modern microecology today, hasn't got to that level of detail and that level of depth. So we are really seeing this really advanced philosophy that is so unknown to the Western world, right? It just hasn't been researched to this level of detail. But I wanted to share that with you just to give you a glimpse into how profound some of these, some of the knowledge really is. So if we move on to the next slide, we can actually get into the Jain philosophy. And I'm going to mention that we're going to talk about two main Jain principles of Ahimsa, which means non-violence or non-harm in Sanskrit, and Aparigraha. So we're going to talk about Ahimsa first, because most of us know about this. Jainism is known for taking Ahimsa to its fullest potential. And essentially, we call it the highest religion, the highest ethical conduct. And it's all about non-violence. We know Mahatma Gandhi adopted this, and his whole movement was inspired by this. Martin Luther King did the same thing. Many climate activists are actually using this, protesting non-violently as well. So this principle of Ahimsa encompasses many Indian philosophies. We see it in Sanatan Dharma, or in Hinduism, it's in Buddhism, it's in the philosophy of yoga, and in Sikhism as well. And four things that come to mind is, what you see on the screen here is that, this sacred reverence for all of nature, from that bacteria to a fully fledged human being or fully fledged animal. It's that, all of these forms of life are equal. And no matter how seemingly insignificant they may seem, like a microorganism, but all of these living organisms are expressions of life, expressions of Jeev, or consciousness, or Atma, or divinity, or whatever name you want to call it. And this is basically dimension of universal love. Ahimsa is essentially this one fact. It's universal love, compassion for others and compassion for yourself. And going back to, the plant-based diet and why it's been around for thousands and thousands of years, is that this whole principle of not wanting to cause harm to anyone or anything, no matter how small. So, why is Ahimsa so important now more than ever? And this principle, why Jainism is so important now more than ever, is because the solution that we need right now in the climate crisis is Ahimsa. And this is the one thing that can be deployed on a mass scale all around the world. And if we move on to the next slide, we're going to talk about there's a little bit of doom and gloom in here, but it's okay, don't worry so much. Extreme. Okay, so right now we know all these things that you see here on the screen, we know that there is a deficiency in Ahimsa. We know that the world has literally gone into full violence mode or full harm mode. We're causing harm to every element of the universe, earth, water, fire, and air. And we also appreciate that what's harmful to nature is harmful to human beings, and what's harmful to human beings is harmful to nature. So all of these things, of course, cause these emissions of greenhouse gases, which you hear about so much in the news. And we know that we use billions of tons of resources to power this global economy. So many things that are happening there. We also know that the sacred reverence of life, if we talk about the earth and the earth bodies you see here, first line there, deforestation, we know trees are the second half of our breathing apparatus, right? So that connection is already there. And it's a sacred one, because without trees, plants, vegetation, we can't breathe. We also know that they are major carbon sinks. So if you look at all the forests in the world, they breathe in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and they store it as biomass, which is the reason why protecting forests is so critical. Soil is also another one, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in terms of degradation. But you see, all of these things, yes, we're causing a lot of harm, but actually the harm that we're seeing externally is perhaps just a reflection of the harm that we do internally in our minds. So when we talk about Jainism, it's also this ancient science of managing the mind, managing negativity, managing emotions, managing desires. There's a war going on in our minds all the time, right? And even the cells, the immune system's constantly fighting. So there's wars going on at the physical, cellular level. There's wars going on at the emotional level when we're dealing with difficult periods in life. We see this reflected also outside in the earth. And this is the kind of, more from a spiritual angle here. But the biggest opportunity that humankind has at the moment is to really step up and design Ahimsa into each of these systems or productions and process systems that we use to live a more comfortable and convenient life. So we're going to go to the next slide. And this is just to give you an illustration of what's happening around the world and to actually fuel not your pessimism about this, but to fuel your inspiration and motivation for action, okay? So on the left-hand side here, you see the global forest harm, or Ahimsa means harm or violence. So we know that every year, roughly more than 2 times the size of Portugal is either, is lost as sort of forest. It's caused by both deforestation and degradation. And you can see these blocks there on the left-hand side. And the bottom one is permanent forest loss. It's deforestation. So around 30% of that 21 million hectares is permanently lost. The other top 3 are things that we can do something about. Well, all of them is things that we can do something about, but the top 3 are things that are to do with production processes. One of them is animal agriculture, the other one plantations, logging, these kind of things. So basically, all of these processes, all of these human-induced activities are causing this severe degradation of forests and releasing greenhouse gases, especially carbon, into the atmosphere. In Latin America and Southeast Asia in particular, you have this commodity-driven deforestation where, it's driven by clearing of the forests for palm oil and a lot actually for beef production as well. It's really fascinating that about 2,600 years ago, Mahavir Bhagwan, who was the last spiritual guide and enlightened master of the Jain tradition, tells us not to cut forests. He even tells us not to excavate the earth. And this was at a time when the world population was probably around 100 million or less. And forest cover was probably super intact, compared to the state that we see today. So at a time when there was no pressure on resources or on the earth, at a time when the rate of deforestation was probably at its lowest, you see this spiritual teacher telling us, don't cut the forests, don't excavate the earth, which I thought was pretty profound to actually have that foresight 2,600 years ago. So there's a lot about soil degradation there as well, but I won't go into that. So this is a really beautiful quote by Mahatma Gandhi, and we all know him and his non-violent march to freedom. And Mahatma Gandhi, this phrase of his, the earth provides enough to satisfy every man's need, but not every man's greed. And you've all heard of this, right? And it's talking about the power of greed, which is lobh in Sanskrit. And it's Greed is so powerful that if left unchecked, it can lead to uncontrollable desires, uncontrollable attachments to things, to people, to places. And just like right now, you know, you're listening to me, you know, you have one thought and then you have a whole bunch of other thoughts happening in your mind at the same time. From those thoughts stem other thoughts. And then from those thoughts, you know, there's a whole multiplier effect going on in terms of the number of thoughts that you have. Same thing happens with desires and wants. The mind is always wanting, always desiring, always thinking. And when you practice meditation, for example, you will notice the nature of the mind to always jump from one thing to another thing to another thing. And it's the same thing with desires that eventually ends up in uncontrolled or unlimited greed. So we know that unrestricted materialism and industrialism has caused so much destruction to our planet, but we can learn tremendously from Gandhi's vision, which very much aligns with Jain principles, and especially the principles of both Ahimsa and Aparigraha. And when it comes to reducing consumerism as well, respecting nature and aiming for sustainable development. So on the next slide, we're going to look into greed a little bit more. And this is pretty much fresh off the press, or it's from Oxfam's latest climate equality report, which was just produced end of last month. And here, it's something we all know. We know that there's huge inequality between the rich, the poor, global south, global north. And you can see here the fact that on the left-hand side, you've got the population share by wealth. And on the right-hand side, you have, you know, what population is causing which emissions. And right at the top in red, most of the emissions that we see, 50% of CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, is caused by the rich and the super rich. And even with this wealth and power, for example, the Kardashian empire or any other empire you can think of, we know it doesn't bring mental peace. We know it doesn't bring mental happiness. And we also know more money, more problems, mental health issues, etc., etc. And what is, again, I know it's pessimistic and I know it's sad, but those who have done the least to cause the climate crisis, so you can see in the green here, and especially the bottom green, the bottom 50%, they're causing the least emissions, but unfortunately, they're the ones who are going to be suffering the most. And these are generally people that are going to be in the more tropical global south regions of the world, more poorer sections of society. And if you look at the next slide, just I wanted to give an example of sustainability. So we talk a lot about sustainable development, sustainable this, sustainable that. And what is unsustainable? This is quite interesting, I thought, that when we look at, and you can actually break this down by country as well, but this is essentially the ecological footprints of each region, each industry, each country. So the way we live right now, it's we need 1.75 Earths to continue living how we live, right? But that also tells us it's a choice that we have. So there are definitely many things that we can do within our realm of control. We don't need to rely on governments. We don't need to rely on politics and the legal systems and the super rich, right? So there are certain things definitely that we can do, but this is just to highlight the fact that, you know, even countries, and it's not on this chart, but you can actually see a breakdown of, for example, the United Arab Emirates actually topped the highest. I think it was about 5 Earths that you would need to continue living as if, you know, if you lived in the UAE. India was actually at the lowest, probably because more than half the population is already in severe poverty. But I thought it was interesting to look at this. On the next slide, we talk about inequality, and I just want to start bringing out more of the climate impacts now. So we know that Dharavi is actually one of Asia's largest slums, and it's just outside of, well, it's in Mumbai, and right next to it is a really affluent neighborhood. But if you live in Dharavi, if you live in the slums, you're going to face 6 degrees, you know, heat higher than what you would do if you were living in just right next door. So the richer sections of society, and by the way, that includes all of us dialing into this call right now. So the richer sections of society can insulate themselves from climate pain. And, you know, you can escape and switch on the air conditioning, or, you know, you can pay for any damages that may be caused to your home. It's really the marginalized and the poorest sections of society that will suffer the most. In the picture you see on the right-hand side, it's about Florida, and this is after the hurricane that hit Florida, and you can see the only house that's left standing is a rich man's house. So climate justice and equality is super important, and those living in poverty, women especially, women, girls, those from indigenous communities, these are the people that are going to be disproportionately more affected by the climate crisis than any other group in the world. I mean, forget the global north, but any other group in the world. So this is an opportunity for us to see, okay, what can we do right now in our lives, in our more charitable parts of our lives or voluntary parts of our lives? What do we want to do to try and help this situation? On the next slide, we're going to go into the second principle. So we talked about Ahimsa quite briefly. Then we have Aparigraha. So Aparigraha means non-possessiveness, non-attachment in Sanskrit. And again, it's one of those top ethical codes of conduct if you're a Jain. And it's also one of the 5 yamas or ethical codes of conduct in the yogic philosophy, same as Ahimsa. So both Ahimsa and Aparigraha feature in this top 5 list for both Jains and in the yogic tradition. But Aparigraha, it's living a contented and spiritual life, right? It's about reducing our desire to possess, to accumulate things, and also our attachment to them. This is fundamental for our own mental health, our spiritual health, and for planetary health. And, by taking only what you need, it's super amazing, because this way you're sort of placing limits on your own mind to say, actually, do I really need that? No, I don't need the second house or the second car or the second coffee cup or whatever it is that you want to buy. It's placing limits on the mind to rein in the mind. And, I mentioned before that the ancient Indian sciences are all about managing the mind. So when you start placing limits to try and curb your greed or curb your desires to possess things, to accumulate things, it's a way to actually live a more sustainable life. It doesn't mean that you're depriving yourself. Taking only what you need is not like saying, I'm going to starve myself. It's just knowing the appropriate measure that's right for you. What do you need in your life? And it's also to minimize waste as well. So placing a limit, for example, on new clothes, on even your annual salary, to say, okay, I don't actually need to earn more than X amount per year. Once I reach that target, okay, fine. And that target doesn't even have to be that high. I know it's a cost of living crisis, but really having a roof over your head, having food on the table, of course, these are the things that count, and you all know this. But we will see in the next part of the presentation a little bit more about, what we can do. But Aparigraha is such an important principle. And in this modern world, this lifestyle that we have, it's driving this unconscious, excessive energy consumption, excessive materialistic accumulation. These are things that are in our control. We can do things about this. So upgrading to a simple, mindful, minimalist life is what we want to try and do. Here, a beautiful picture of, and it's quite difficult to get pictures of Jain ascetics. So these are Jain monks and nuns. And it's, these are the real champions of Ahimsa and Aparigraha. So the conduct of Jain monks and nuns is such that they don't own anything, they don't own any money, and they travel on foot, if some without shoes. They are arguably the world's only humans with the lowest carbon footprint, the lowest water footprint, the lowest tech footprint, any footprint, the lowest harm footprint in the world. And there's not many of them, right? And they're generally in India. Some of them use, for example, less than a bowl of water a day to brush your teeth, to drink water, to wash the utensils, and they only own the things that they carry, as you can see in this picture, a little broomstick and some pots and pans and whatever they're wearing. But this really ancient ascetic way of life was essentially to get rid of all these desires, to get rid of the greed, to get rid of this desire to possess. And it was about striving for freedom, striving for mental freedom, striving for physical freedom. And it's really sacred indigenous wisdom in the sense that it's striving for a purpose to transcend the body, to transcend the mind, to transcend the 5 senses, and actually connect to what's really important, which is the true nature of consciousness. So I want to draw a parallel here to the indigenous communities of the world. So just like how you see, these Jain monks and nuns living a very, this is thousands and thousands of years old, this ascetic way of life, causing minimal harm to the earth, minimal harm to every living organism. The parallel I want to draw is actually with the indigenous communities around the world. Say, for example, the Amazon in Peru or in America, in Australia. The world's best forest guardians are indigenous peoples. And indigenous peoples carry with them this really ancient wisdom of life, for life, how to sacredly, revere nature, how to live within nature in a sustainable way. And similar to these Jain ascetics that you see here, they are living in harmony with nature. They are not taking anything from nature. And of course, we live in a world where we're continuously taking, we're continuously extracting. So the climate crisis impacts and causes, and I want to go into the next slide and the next topic just to give you a little bit of the science if you're not familiar with it. Again, I'm not presenting anything new in this webinar, but just to highlight some things that are important for you to know. So, of course, we feel like a very entitled species, and this is a really nice illustration that I picked up from LinkedIn. And, our whole existence is basically this interdependent web of life that we talked about at the beginning, which is bound by mutual support and interdependence. And every corner of life, so every corner of this triangle breathes, this consciousness, Jeev, Atma, divinity. And from a Jain perspective, each and every sentient living being, is equal. There is no hierarchy. There is no pyramid, as you see here. But humans tend to think that, oh, we're on top of the world. We're on top of the pyramid. We're on top of the chain. So I want to point out bees here. So you might see the little bee there in the middle. 75% of our food is pollinated by bees. But we know that air pollution, use of pesticides, loss of habitat, reducing bee numbers, etc., is basically causing their populations to decline substantially. And less bees means less food. So how can we attract more bees into our gardens, more bees into our front lawns, our back gardens? And that's by planting, nectar-bearing flowers like marigold or sunflower, just to increase those population of bees so that we don't break down this pyramid. So if we move to the next slide, these are things that you all know about the climate crisis. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this, but I do want to emphasize that, we are at the most critical juncture in the Earth's history to shape the future of our planet. And it's bigger than everything and anything that we've seen so far in history. So the choices and actions that we make, no matter how insignificant you think they may be, they are not. So, the impacts of climate crisis is not happening to someone else or someone in the global south. The impacts of climate crisis will affect us. They will be on our doorstep, no matter where you are in the world. And so the choices and actions that we implement in our lives, they will make a difference. And we'll go into that a little bit more when we talk about solutions. But again, going back into the science on the next slide, I want to show you a really nice graph from NASA, just to put things into perspective. And you might really be flabbergasted by this, like I was when I first saw this. But here you see the atmospheric carbon dioxide emission levels over the last 800,000 years. So on the y-axis, you see a measurement there of atmospheric carbon. And essentially that means, if we're talking about 400 parts per million is the number of CO2 molecules per million molecules of dry air. So carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas, traps heat, makes, the temperatures go up, lingers around for about thousands of years and traps more of the sun's energy. Now, of course, this is the highest it's ever been in history in the last 3 to 5 million years. And we also know the Earth's climate has changed quite significantly. You can see those ups and downs in the graph there. And that's when we had all the different ice ages. So I think we've had about 8 ice ages since, the last one was about 12,000 years ago. But, since the onset of the Industrial Revolution, the 18th century, human activities basically snowballed CO2 off the charts. And that's where you see now it's sort of the 419, close to 420 level. And if you look at Earth's history, if you compare it to a calendar year, modern humans have probably been around for about 37 minutes. And, we've managed to use up a third of the Earth's natural resources in the last 0.2 seconds. So yes, is it scary? Of course. Is it alarming? Of course. but there are solutions. So if we go to the next slide, and we're going to talk about plant-based economies and plant-based diets, because the signature trademark of Jainism, and a very big one, is the diet. Everyone talks about the diets. What are you eating? Root vegetables, not root vegetables, eggs, not eggs, dairy, not dairy, etc. And many of us are vegetarians and vegans for this reason, of course, of Ahimsa. Science is now conceding, many climate scientists, have said this immediate direct reduction in carbon emissions globally, 2,000 gigatons, and 1 gigaton is about 1 billion tons of CO2 emissions, 1 billion metric tons. So if we were all to convert to a plant-based diet, we could we can actually lower those emission levels from 420 right now back to below or at around 350 parts per million. So this is something that we can do, that we can advocate within our families, with our friends, that this is a very relatively easy step. I think there are many countries in the world that are already introducing plant-based measures or increasing plant-based foods, diets within all the various schools, hospitals, institutions, etc. But I wanted to mention that because it's such a big thing for Jains. The next slide, this is just telling you again, going back to the diet point, that plant-based diet versus animal-based diet, you can see most of the ice-free land on Earth is used for animal grazing, 37%, right? Huge. And if we go to the next slide here, I wanted to also show you, what greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of certain food products. Now you can play around with this yourself. Our Weldon data is the data source here. There's a lot of research that's been done into this. So here you might be surprised to see, dark chocolate's quite high on the list there. I think everyone knows about beef and cattle and the fact that so much CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions comes from that. And it's essentially clearing the Amazon rainforest. But chocolate, why is chocolate on that list? And I'm a huge chocolate fan. But when you look at where chocolate comes from, so West Africa, huge biodiversity hotspot, high rates of deforestation. So of course, when you're chopping down the trees, you lose those carbon sinks, you emit CO2 into the atmosphere. Now, this graph, if you look, obviously, of course, at the lower end of the spectrum, you've got all the different vegetables that you see here, other vegetables, 0.5 kg, absolutely tiny. So this is the science, this is the proof, this is the evidence that going on a plant-based diet, and vegan diets are actually the best, but going, vegetarian, vegan, whatever change you make is a change that's good enough for you. This graph actually doesn't take account of the holistical or ecological impacts of these foods. So for example, water consumption, ethical production practices, the level of pain and suffering that all these animals experience. So it's not giving you a full picture. But I wanted to show that to you because it's so important that we start advocating the clearer food labeling when it comes to supermarkets, where we buy our food from. You need to know, where has this come from? How much water has been used? How much land has been cleared? How many greenhouse gases have been emitted in producing this food? So I think, again, this slide, we all know from climate crisis, these are all the areas that are going to be impacted. The Jains have a very beautiful way of life in the sense that, it's this living with harmony with the universe, maintaining a balance. And this can be accessed by anyone, right? It's a spiritual tradition, everyone's equal, it's open to anyone, but it's about building resilience. So the challenge that we have is that how can we build more compassion, more resilience, more adaptability as humans in the way that we respond to what's going to be coming in the next few decades. And this, we can already draw from this really beautiful and rich philosophy of Jainism and how to do that. So we're going to move on to the next slide to talk about the fact that unfortunately or fortunately, we will see food shortages. So of course, if you want to be on a diet and lose lots of weight, this is going to be fantastic for you. But food shortages are real. There is a movement called the Save Soil movement, which I'd encourage everyone to join, just to learn more about what's happening to our soils and to actually then start to grow your own vegetables. So the current trajectory that we're facing right now is that there could be a war over food, as there will be over water and all of Earth's precious natural resources in the coming decades. the way we face that war depends on how we are as human beings and the virtues that we develop, spiritual virtues like empathy, compassion, equanimity, reducing our likes and dislikes for food, for example. But I'd encourage you to join this movement. You know, nearly 90% of life on Earth depends on soil, and 95% of all the food that we eat comes from soil. So something for you to look at in your spare time, and I hope you get some more insights into this. So there's so much to talk about, and I know I have so many slides to share with you, but again, this one is just showing you the global average surface temperature increase compared to the 1850 to 900 benchmark level. Now at COP right now in Dubai, they're discussing, you know, the 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees. The Paris Climate Change Agreement nearly a decade ago was, you know, all of these countries, about nearly 200, coming together to say they're going to try and limit greenhouse gas emissions to 1.5 degrees. We're at 1.1 degree right now. So the lower the number, the lower the climate risk. But if we, and you'll see on this visual here that, you know, already we're getting into the red zone and we've gone up +1, 1.1. So if we go to the next slide, and I just wanted to show you here, you might have already seen this in the Guardian newspaper. This is directly from the Interpanel Governmental Committee for Climate Change, the reports that they have out there. But essentially, if you're born in the 1980s onwards, you will be experiencing more heat, more global warming, etc. So if we move to the next slide, definitely next summer will probably be the coldest summer for the rest of your life. We will love good weather. It can only mean that we will no longer become vitamin D deficient. And I know for Indians, that's a really big thing. It's either iron or it's vitamin D. So we'll get rid of the vitamin D problem. And the iron problem you will have to work on if you're a vegetarian. So the next slide, I wanted to show you the impacts, you know, when we look at 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees of global warming, what the impacts are. And you can, you know, see this for yourself. It's on the World WWF, World Wildlife NGO that has put this together. But essentially, you know, currently the implemented policies from governments result in projected emissions of probably around 2.2 to 3.5 degrees. Of course, that is tremendously worrying, and I completely understand the sentiments of those of you who shared your feedback. But let's now move into, you know, what can we actually do about this? We know that the causes of the climate crisis are practically, you know, of course we talk about fossil fuels, but what's driving the fossil fuels? What's the underlying cause? We consume too much. We have a very linear take, make, waste model. We need to move to more circular models. We have a win-lose mentality because most of our organizations are geared for profit maximization. An example, you know, a sick patient is a profitable patient. A patient who is forever single and using dating apps is a profitable patient. A person who's always online on social media is a profitable person, right? When it comes from an organizational profit maximizing point of view. And we also have these incompatible metrics, GDP. GDP, gross domestic product, tells you nothing about the integrity and the health of your web of life, of the ecosystems of nature, which is practically the backbone behind most businesses right now. If they were to include the cost of nature, they would be in the negative. So let's now move on to the solution space. Now, the solutions that we have in front of us really are all about designing Ahimsa and Aparigraha into our lives. So as an individual, you do have a voice, you do have impact, and you do have value. And so, you know, people are always saying, oh, it's, you know, we need systematic change at the government level, at this level, at that level. But things start off at grassroots first, right? And then the movement grows. And I think as an Oshwal community, or as a Jain community, we have this wealth of wisdom and knowledge and principles that are actually forming the backbone of how we conduct our lives today, and will form the backbone of many humans that will actually begin to enroll into this system of non-violence, into the system of minimal living, simple living, high thinking, right? And so how can we best do this? And we're actually going to do a bit of a live quiz at the moment because I know we're running out of time. So again, we're going to go back into menti.com. So it's the same login that you had before. And there you will see a question come up about, what do you think we can do? How can we step up as individuals and community? What can we do in this space? So I would love to hear what you think. What can we do to step up when it comes to the climate crisis? I've shared so much information with you. I kind of had to whiz through it all. So I'm sorry if it went a bit too fast. I also was conscious of the fact that this is not about doom and gloom. I want to give you the message that there is hope. We are planting the seeds of action here, and everything that you do has meaning, has value. Whatever you can do in your life, you can do it. So here we've seen grow your own. Yes, grow your own. Perfect. Grow your own vegetables. Do your own compost. Amazing. Reducing consumption. Absolutely hitting the nail on the head there. And that's Aparigraha. So solar panels. Excellent. Not just at Potter's Bar. I think it's solar panels for everyone here. Proactive and be heard. Live simply. Yes. Recycle. Yes, of course. Excellent. Teach more about Jainism like you're doing. Thank you. Have the environment and nature at the forefront of every decision you make. Now, that is absolutely critical. That is absolutely critical. Eat no meat. Grow flowers for bees. Yes, exactly. That's what we want to do. Cycle and walk more. So I don't know if any of you have an electric bike. My partner gifted me an electric bike from Van Moof. Unfortunately, they've gone bankrupt. I think they've been bought out by someone else. But electric bikes, I actually don't own a car. Funnily enough, I don't own a car and I prefer to use public transport, or I walk, or I bug my friends for lifts. Less materialism. Yes, exactly. And these are all principles. And what you're saying here, this is all Ahimsa. This is all how to reduce our harm. This is all Aparigraha. How do we curb our consumption? How do we live this minimalist life? Learn about permaculture. Yes, very important. So a lot about transport here, walking and cycling. And thinking before acting. Yes. Greenwashing. Yes. Electric vehicles. Yeah, exactly. Because electric vehicles, a car is still a car, right? It's still on the road. You still need roads, which has cement, which blocks the soil, blocks the earth, and increases temperatures on cement, right? Be kind to the environment. Exactly. Excellent. I now thank you so much for your feedback on there. It's wonderful to hear your contributions to this. And we're going to look at the next slide now. And it's going to be about, how can I step up as an individual? So how do we step up as an individual? So these are just some things for you to think about. And the one in the middle, conscious consumerism. So it was already mentioned in the Menti slide, reducing consumption. But conscious consumerism is really about, having that power. You decide where your money goes, right? When you support local businesses or brands that are embedding or trying really hard to embed sustainability and ethics into their business model, this will accelerate their growth, and it will also encourage other businesses to adopt those best practices. So where you spend your money, that is your power. And that is what you can do immediately to help with the climate crisis. So it is about looking for those brands, those companies, and doing your research as well, right? You, of course, don't want to be greenwashed. Doing your research and evaluating, looking at, for example, the traceability of the products, how transparent are the value chains, what are those end-to-end life cycle emissions, water consumption, the ethical practices that they consume. What are they doing with waste? Waste management is a big one. We know that the fashion industry is a huge polluter. It's about slow fashion, not fast fashion. It's about longevity. It's about conscious consumerism, where we're really looking into reducing our own individual ecological footprint. You've got many other things here as well. So we talked about, attracting more bees, rewilding. I don't know what it is, but many Indians many years ago, they kind of cemented over their front lawns, and there's a lot of pavement in the back gardens. Let the soil breathe. No need to put pavement over fertile soil. And we know that, soil is such a precious, and it will be the most precious commodity right now and in future generations to come. So plant more trees, attract the bees, placing limits to your wealth, to the number of cars you have, the houses you have, how many clothes you want to buy. Reducing consumption altogether and placing those limits is fantastic and will really help. Learning to grow your own vegetables and composting. This is a skill that we can learn over time, and this is a skill that will be needed in the decades to come. So it will be extremely valuable to start cultivating that skill from now. Reducing and avoiding dairy products is also quite important as well, not just from the harm that it causes to mother cows, but also the fact that you saw from the graph before, the emissions, the water, etc. footprint of dairy, of cheese is very high. We've talked about walking and biking. Getting solar panels has already been mentioned. Let's do it in all our homes. And the next slide, we're going to quickly talk about how can we step up as a community. So, the Oshwal community is a really powerful community, and Jains in general are a very powerful community around the world. They're so small, 6 million-ish, but for example, in India, they pay the highest taxes. So we're talking about a very successful financially community around the world. And we have so much that we can give back. We have so many things that we can do when it comes to advocacy and activism. And what I mean by that is, let's start to be an example to the world using these principles of Ahimsa and Aparigraha, which we've learned about, which you already know about if you are a Jain or practicing Jain, is that advocacy and activism is going to be the core of driving change, whether it means writing or emailing or social media to your supermarket, to get them to do more food labeling, whether it's, hassling your local MP or whatever it is. You start small and you start building, and it's really about how can we as a community step up and use this ancient indigenous knowledge that we have access to, that we have been born into, to help us fight the worst of the climate crisis. So many things here. Encouraging education in Jainism is really important. We need to continue this knowledge for future generations. Climate finance, this intersection of Jain principles with climate science and microecology we touched upon earlier. This is a very interesting thing to look into. And many universities like Birmingham University right now are offering Jain studies. We know that SOAS has been doing that for a long time. And we have Arihant Institute, which is another online Jain learning platform that's also offering and engaged studies in Jainism. So there's lots of opportunities there to learn more about this faith, more about this ancient wisdom that we have in this world right now. And, there's not many people that are actually practicing it when we talk about numbers compared to our 8.1 billion population. But this is the way that we need to go. So I know we're running to time here, so thank you so much. If we move to the next slide. Oh, just sorry, before I go there, further reading. So there's this amazing book by Atul K. Shah, and it's called Inclusive and Sustainable Finance. And he talks about communities being like rainforests. The fact that, they take thousands of years to grow and be nourished, but then they're very easy to be destroyed. But this is not what we want, right? We want our community to be a change agent when it comes to the climate crisis. Many other resources there as well that you can look into. Next slide, I'd like to thank you very much for tuning in and listening to my voice for the last hour or so. You can contact me on LinkedIn. You can feel free to email me. I'd love to have a conversation. If you're passionate about any of these topics, very happy to discuss them in more detail with you. If there's anything that you want to learn more about, please let me know. And yeah, thank you so much. And Michami Dubram, if I have said anything incorrectly, or I ask for your forgiveness for that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Serena. I'm sure I speak for all of us that was incredibly insightful. There's so much to fit into just under an hour. I've personally learned a lot from that, and I'm left wanting more. So thank you for prompting us to think about what we can do as individuals and as a community, and talking about this with such passion. Many will not know, but this has been months in the making. So Serena, a huge thank you again. Also marks a great point for us to remind our members that we are looking to move to a more paperless model for our official communications. Therefore, if you haven't done so already, please do visit our website, to opt in for electronic communications and notices going forward. Just whilst we're at the top of the hour, I'd like to give a big thanks to Kilit and Pavin for your support in getting this session administered so smoothly. And lastly, thank you to all of you who made the time on your Sunday to tune in. We truly hope you found this useful, and if you'd like to see similar sessions in the future, please do get in touch. Thank you again, wishing you all a great end to your weekend and a productive week ahead.